Welcome to Boots on the Ground with Fishers and Farmers. I'm Nancy North, Communications and Outreach Lead for Fishers and Farmers, here with co-hosts Amy Smith and Heidi Coiler today. This Boots on the Ground series is a program of Fishers and Farmers Partnership for the Upper Mississippi River Basin. It's a national fish habitat partnership focused on respectfully connecting farmers, landowners, scientists, and all collaborators to listen and work together for resilient farms, streams, and fish. We cultivate a network of learning and exchange and produce a radio program, host workshops, and provide annual grants to local farmer-driven initiatives. Welcome. Today, we're excited to introduce you to Lee Tesdell, Katie Rock, Keegan Kult, John Norwood, and Tanner Pulse, who are all involved in a really innovative project in Polk County, Iowa. Polk County is about 50% metro and 50% rural, and it's a place where nitrate in drinking water has been a hot topic recently. So in response to their challenge, this team has designed a coordinated bidding and construction process that they will have a lot to tell you about. And best of all, they are very, very ready to share this process and help others do it. So thank you all for being here. Today, Lee Tesdell is with us. He is a fourth generation farmer and owner of Tesdell Century Farm in Polk County. He's put into place both infield and edge of field practices on his 80-acre farm, which is in the 4 Mile Creek watershed in the county. Lee and his tenant and neighbor, Mike Helen, work together to learn how to be better conservation farmers. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you, Nancy.
Katie Rock is with us. She's served as a commissioner with Polk County Soil and Water Conservation District since 2016. Katie serves on the executive committee of the North Raccoon River Watershed Management Coalition. She has a background in agricultural research and now leads the Sierra Club Initiative for Clean Energy and Transition in Iowa. She grew up on a farm outside Muscatine, Iowa. Welcome, Katie.
Yes, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Keegan Kult is Executive Director for the Agricultural Drainage Management Coalition. It's a national group of agriculture, industry, and environmental partners that promote drainage, water conservation practices. Keegan grew up in rural Iowa, and he worked 10 years as an environmental scientist with Iowa Soybean Association before taking on this role. Welcome, Keegan.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy.
Tanner Pulse is the watershed coordinator for Polk County SWCD. Welcome, Tanner. Before joining this group in 2018, he was a technician with the Iowa DNR Water Quality Bureau. And John Norwood. John is a board member of the Polk County SWCD, and he's owner of TBL Ventures, which is a business focused on solving complex resource problems in agriculture, business, and government. He has a background in public finance, watershed management, soils, and hydrology, and has worked in the ag sector in Iowa, California, and on the East Coast. Welcome, John.
Good afternoon.
As I thought about this group, I have a couple things I want to just put in listeners' minds before we start. This is pretty innovative, and as I reflected on it, and I've heard these folks' story before several times, and there is a pattern I see that I'm wondering if you can notice as they tell their story. I have heard them tell about paying attention, about listening, about stepping back to reflect, about talking out loud about their ideas with other people, and watching what rises, and also just asking for input before they finalize things. So see if you hear some of those things. And our question, this will be the question you discuss in the small group, but also think about this. What they're talking about is really proactive versus reactive. If it looks like it's a fit for your area, what kind of old thinking would you have to let go of in order to adopt it? Katie, I'm going to start with you. asking, a lot of participants may not know that much about Polk County's land and the waterways and challenges. So before we dive into specifics about this work you've been doing, will you tell us a little bit about the county and the needs landowners face and what the SWCD faces in a county like yours?
Yeah, well, thank you, Nancy. So Polk County is the home of Des Moines, the largest metro city in and its surrounding suburbs. It's the capital. And as you'd mentioned, we're about 50-50 as far as urban and rural land. Our suburbs are growing rapidly. We have some of the fastest growing suburbs in the country. So that's good for the state. But it does raise some land use questions, and we do have a metro planning group that is very focused on how can we incorporate green space and manage stormwater proactively. So that's some of the main questions on the urban side. And on the ag side, we're proud of our rich heritage in agriculture. We respect private property rights. But we do care about water quality in our state, and again, limiting flood damages on farm fields. And so a lot of our water quality work that goes upstream is focused on those issues. And of course, we want farmers to be profitable too. So we have three main rivers. Des Moines is a city that's a city at the convergence of two rivers, the Raccoon River and the Des Moines River. We also have the Skunk River that flows through the county. And so we're starting to build up more green space and things like bike trails along those river belts to help kind of boost public recreation. But we're trying to balance that with conservation on the ground. Our district's also involved with a number of watershed organizations. I think 5 total, we're up to 5. And we're lucky to have a couple coordinators on staff to help us work in those watersheds. And this project takes place in one of the smaller watersheds that we're involved with, 4 Mile Creek, which experienced some really heavy flash flooding 3 years ago. They got about 7 inches of rain in a few hours overnight in June of 2018, caused millions of dollars in damage, and a few people lost their lives. And I think we see a trend that in Iowa, water quality is a contentious issue, but in the face of a natural disaster, people set those differences aside and start to look at these problems again with fresh eyes. So I think this is a really exciting project that I've been happy to see come together. And we've had a really interesting mix of people that have been willing to sit down and have a conversation and come up with something new. So I'm happy to share that with you.
Yeah, thank you. John, there are a lot of hardworking people who've been building farms and taking care of waterways in Polk County for a long time. So why is this? Can you tell us why a different approach is needed and how this all got started?
Thanks, Nancy. Yes, and I think it got started really in the way that your video described, your introductory video, with people getting together, perhaps from different experience and backgrounds, and asking questions and listening, and thinking about how might we take some new approaches to things that we've always done a certain way, just maybe because of habit or just that's the way we learned how to do it. And so what informed my thinking, I spent a lot of my time as a business transformation coach, working with businesses. Usually it's cross-functional issues and trying to figure out how do you grow that business? How do you drive down costs? How do you increase efficiency and so forth? And so I had that sort of mindset as I was thinking. The other thing, and Katie, I think, nicely sort of gave some of the background of the geography of our state, but some of the things that have struck me are Iowa as a state is one of the top 10 agricultural producers in the world. If we were our own country, we would be in the top 10. We're only behind California. And the numbers are staggering. We grow on 23 million acres of row crops, corn and beans. We're number one, and generally number 1 or 2 in corn and beans. We, of the 23 million acres, 12 million are tiled, which means we have drainage infrastructure to help drain that land to make it productive. And then 6 of the 12 are associated with drainage districts. So those are state chartered districts where basically landowners are working together cooperatively to drain and improve the soil. So those were some of the sort of the big picture numbers. And it occurred to me, we really need to figure out how can we scale our activities. In asking work, when I first joined as a commissioner in 2018, I spent a lot of time asking our staff, how do you do your work? And it turned out we were going to landowners, if we could find them, and trying to sell them maybe on 30 different practices. And it turned out that was too many different choices. There wasn't any way to really get any concentration. And so I got together with our staff people and some others that were experts in the field of drainage. Keegan Kult's one of his colleagues, Charlie Schaefer, and we began to reimagine, do we have to do these, practices? We picked saturated buffers as a starting point. Do we have to do them? We were doing them one at a time, and we were doing 1 or 2 a year. We said, well, look, if we just focus on this one thing, not trying to sell people on 30, how might we change our approach? So Charlie and Keegan and Tanner and Katie and Lee and others, Charlie, we began to rethink how might we do this? And we settled on the thought that let's start with maps and targets and go through sequentially the delivery system. So the maps helped us identify from a sales and marketing perspective who we want to go after. And then we thought about the delivery. Charlie Schaefer said, John, drainage contractors don't want to do one saturated buffer at a time. It's not efficient. So we came up with a bundling strategy where we would do many at the same time. And we would drive down the unit economics to do that. We would accelerate adoption, and we would increase value. And so that's the kernel of the idea. This approach can be applied to soil health. It can be applied to larger infrastructure. It's really the process that you described in your video.
Thanks a lot, John. Lee, I have a question for you. As a landowner, were you involved in this? John mentioned you, and I know you have a great interest in this. And were other landowners involved?
Yeah, so thanks. I don't think I was formally a member of any committee, but we've had many conversations. The 5 of us here in different arenas and different times. And so I'm always willing to, suggest some ideas. And I've always said that the landowner tenant or operator relationship is very important when it comes to conservation. These edge of field practices, however, are really more up to the landowner, whereas in-field practices like cover crops and no-till would be more the subject for discussion between the tenant and the landowner. We really are responsible for the edge of field stuff, and I was personally interested, and the way I got started with edge of field was I started talking with Matt Helmers at Iowa State University about ag drainage, and gave me some ideas. And then I worked with Iowa Soybean Association. We got some NRCS equip money, and I think there was Walton Foundation money involved. And we put in a wood chip bioreactor 9 years ago. And so that was my start. And but yeah, so I've had some input over the years, and I do like to push this idea of landowners and operators working together as much as we can, and then landowners in a watershed working together as well, like on this Blitz program that we're involved in now.
Mhm. Thanks. So you've been kind of a model, it sounds like.
Well, I don't know if I'm a model. I don't, but I am. I'm in a good location for field days. Iowa Soybean Association brings people out, and we schedule various events every year. I'm close, and I do like to interact with folks, and I hope that we have these discussions at my field days, and I hope that folks go away with ideas for their own watersheds.
Mhm. Thank you. On this one, you can decide who will answer this one, but help people get it. Will you help people get an idea of what's actually rolled out? Like how does this look now? And what did it take to get from that idea that John described to this, to today?
Maybe I'll take a stab at it, but a lot of planning. This was really, I think this was a really unique project in that it wasn't a project to begin with. There wasn't a big grant, funding this work. There wasn't, a specified RFP that we, put together. This proposal is more of, all right, we have these funding mechanisms now. How can we make these work and work in a way that's a lot better for everyone involved? And so, we got the right people in the room, and it really helped things go a long way. So we had, Tanner with the good landowner relationships was there, and he knows how to, manage the financial systems with, the state WQI money. John Swanson, who couldn't be here today from Polk County, great project management skills that I don't know if he knew he had those beforehand or not, but he was really on top of, keeping everybody in constant communication. And he also kind of had that background of knowing how to make state funding work on different sites. And now he works for Polk County itself and has that kind of local county funding hat on, and he knows how to make that work and the relationships that are necessary there. Myself with ADMC, I kind of had the technical knowledge and experience of how to do it the wrong way, maybe, of trying to get these practices out there. And so, it was just a lot of communication early on. We kind of say this project's taken about a year. Really, we probably started working really hard on it in November of 2019, is kind of when it all kind of formalized. And then the outreach started there the spring of 2020. And, but, Tanner and John Swanson and myself sat down many times and thought, all right, this timeline, and maybe it was nice because we didn't actually have hard deadlines because it wasn't a formal grant. Like, what's the best timeline to enroll all of this whole project and make sure like all these pieces were in place, so even when we sent the outreach letters, that was kind of our control, and we picked the time of the year that we sent those outreach letters to the farmers and landowners, just because we knew that would work better if we sent them, early March, and then we followed up with a phone call, and then the survey crews were able to go out there when, the time is right to survey, and then we had the summer to design. And unfortunately, we thought we might get these things installed in December of last year, but I guess it wasn't a bad thing. We thought we'd stick with 25 sites initially, but we got a lot more interest in maybe what we knew to do with it, and we ended up with 51 sites moving forward. So it took a little bit longer than we thought to get everything going. So now we're doing the installs this summer, but everybody, we never thought we'd be turning people away with this program. And if you've ever done any of these edge of field practices before, the ability to be selective isn't always the case, especially with a lot of the demonstration projects. So we were very excited that we were able to turn down sites. And Tanner, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you guys surveyed about 120 outlets, last
130,
last spring and summer. And so we were actually turning sites down. And if we had a little bit more capacity, we probably would have done more than 50 this first year. But no, it was just that constant communication with all the partners involved and everybody wanting to make it work. And we kind of hit that critical mass of numbers that people were like, all right, it's a really bad look, if we have these sites ready to go, if we don't figure out a way to make it work. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, Nancy, but
Sure it did.
I took an
Well,
attempt.
the enthusiasm is incredible. I'm sure that every listener here would just be head over heels if they had that kind of participation and joy in what's going on. What's the chemistry? Like what you talked about the chemistry between the planners, but maybe Tanner, you could give us an idea about why is it so popular?
Well, kind of one of the big things that we wanted to do when starting this project is typically these edge of field practices, they just realistically don't have a large direct benefit to the landowner. So historically, they've been kind of a tough sell. Even in the past, when we were providing 100% cost share for these projects and there was no direct cost to the landowner, there's still a lot of paperwork and the traditional kind of NRCS cost share process where they have to hire the contractor themselves and then apply for reimbursement. Then they're taxed for the project cost as income when it comes to the end of the year and time to pay taxes. So even though on paper we were giving 100% cost share, there was still cost to the landowner and there was still what we were kind of calling the hassle factor throughout a lot of this. So the goal of this project was to really, if we could reduce that hassle as much as possible, could we kind of really pique landowner interest and get more people interested in the project. So that's where our new kind of fiscal agent funding model came into place. And instead of the landowners hiring the contractors, Polk County acted as a fiscal agent and we kind of grouped all the money together and hired the contractors through the county so that the landowners didn't have to deal with contractors directly. And then we also avoided that kind of taxable income at the end of the year issue. And then we also provided what was originally kind of called an incentive payment, but we kind of reworked that into a temporary construction easement through the county, which both kind of added some protection to the landowner. If anytime we work with contractors, if there's a rut over here, something didn't get fixed, we weren't quite happy with, that easement provided protection for the landowner, that contractor, we had kind of a way to make the contractor come out and fix things before everything's finalized. And through that temporary easement, we were able to provide a easement payment to the landowner to kind of help compensate for their time meeting with us, letting us come onto their land and letting a public contractor onto their land. And then also we tried to eliminate as much of the paperwork as possible, but at the end of the day, there's going to be paperwork. So they had to meet with us a few times to sign a bunch of papers. So I would say that really helped increase kind of landowner excitement about the project. And then also just us as a team, we worked really hard to build those relationships with landowners. At the end of the day, we tried to be as not super invasive on our original phone calls. We didn't want to immediately say, we want to do this project, this. We kind of phrased it as, hey, we're looking at doing this project. For right now, we kind of just want permission to come survey your property, see if something works, and kind of really start that relationship without making them kind of sign a document right up front or sign up for something right up front, and really work on kind of letting them get to know us and trust us before we brought out the contracts and had them sign on the dotted line.
Yeah, that's great. And Tanner did a great job describing all of that. And I'll even throw in there just, it's so simple, but the direct outreach, we probably don't do that enough, and there's not enough capacity a lot of times in various field offices and other, in counties to have the time and staff resources to dedicate to that direct outreach. But just those phone calls, we were very effective with every phone, majority of the times whenever we got a hold of somebody, they would at least give us that yes to come out and take a look to see how many outlets that they have and kind of give them that feedback of how many practices could actually work on their farm. And, sometimes I think we sell farmers and landowners short that they're not interested in participating, but I just think we don't do a good enough job sometimes of actually sending that message that this project's here, these are the benefits to you, and just being a little bit more aggressive of trying to actually reach out and connect with the farmer.
Anyone else have anything to add on that?
I tie, this is John here. I would tie a few of the ideas here together. One is the theme or the idea that Polk County Soil and Water Conservation District, we're one of 100 in the state of Iowa. And fundamentally, we are a learning organization We are learning how to do things. We're de-risking them. We're figuring out what are the right roles and responsibilities. And we figure out how to do it, and then we share the learning. And we're super excited that the state now is looking at rolling this out to the rest of, or to the other counties that are interested, because we know as Katie mentioned, we're at the intersection of two major river systems, 3 rivers. We drain, there's about 20% of Iowa water that comes through our county. So we're like a barometer, and we know we can't solve this issue ourselves. So we have to learn how to do some of this stuff and share. The second idea is really taking a systems approach to doing things. So it's not asking every landowner to solve it on their own. It's working together as a team and thinking about the system. And you just heard Tanner and Keegan talk about, elements of the system, the marketing, the delivery, the contracting, and so forth. And part of that systems approach is figuring out what are the organizational roles that everybody can play. Let's not trip over each other. What does the county do? What does the soil and water district do? What is Keegan's, what's the role for Keegan's organization? And so that thinking can be applied elsewhere. And then finally, a lot of this boils down to, I think, making stuff easy. Either on, as Lee talked about, there's operators, the guy driving the tractor or the woman driving the tractor, and there's the landowner. Landowner might be down in Florida for all we know. And in Iowa, 60% of the landowners don't even live in the state. So you got to make it easy you got to think about both parties, the farmer and the landowner, and you got to make it turnkey. You really got to try to make it easy for them to do. So they don't have the lady down in Florida who owns the land and gets a check. She doesn't want to figure out how to do a bunch of this stuff. She may be interested in the story and willing to, sign on the dotted line, as Tanner talked about, but you got to make it easy and understandable. So those are some of the things I think would be useful for the audience to understand.
Thank you. When you were putting this together, did you run into any huge bumps, like things that you just didn't know what to do with, or real problems that you had to deal with? And what'd you do?
I guess maybe one of the bigger ones that we ran into kind of late in the game was we were planning on utilizing some FSA Clear Initiative funding to provide a significant portion of the match on a lot of these practices. And we actually had, conversations with the right people at the state FSA offices, and they were all on board, and they were in those meetings with us when we were talking about, the number of sites that we'd be working with and how we would make this work with other programs, matching payments on it. And then as a result of the 2018 Farm Bill coming out so late and all the rule interpretations that were put in place late last summer, there was a rule put in place that basically that people couldn't assign payment anymore. So that's what our fiscal agent model is all based around. And so it really threw a big wrench in it. And so we kind of had to scramble and find more ways to fund it. And luckily it really helped to have that many number of sites on hand. So nobody wanted to see it fail. So people worked a little bit harder to step up to the plate. And so IDOLS really came through with funding. And then, the city of Des Moines stepped in then too, because they heard about this and they know it's upstream of them and they were excited about it. So they stepped up with funding, but they kind of, people like putting their name behind a project that looks like it's going to work. So it definitely helped to have that many sites in place when after that happened.
You mentioned people liking to be to support a project that looks like it's going to work. I've been wondering if you had to get approval on this from anything, and if there was pushback in the beginning. Like, did people understand what you were after from the beginning, or did you have to kind of keep explaining it?
So there was actually, John, were you gonna take that one?
Go ahead, Tanner. Go ahead.
There was actually a decent amount of pushback, funny enough, from even the organizations that were involved with the project. We kind of had a lot of rules set in place for how we do things, and this was a very different way of doing things. So there was a lot of breaking down walls and kind of changing the way the rules are written, and a lot of cases writing entirely new agreements between organizations so that we could make that happen. So I would say, yes, we definitely had some hurdles, and a lot of them came internally, but we're hoping through this project we can kind of help to realize what those hurdles are and express them, and hopefully get a lot of them changed in more than just our area to make it easier for other people to kind of follow in our footsteps.
And I'd amplify that. I'm so proud of Keegan and Tanner and John Swanson and the team that really took on this project. And, you know, you start with that vision. How can we do this in a new way? And yeah, you have to repeat that, talk about it a lot, and you have to solve, you have to problem solve. And it's probably, you know, it's like going down the football field. You're going to have all these blocks, people coming at you from different directions maybe you didn't see. And so that resiliency and that, you know, that persistence to keep moving the ball forward. And as a learning organization, you know, we're not going to be 100% successful. We're going to have some failure. That's part of it. And if we're not having some failure, probably we're not, you know, we're not pushing enough. So I'm just so excited because I think this is just the start. There really is a lot of new thinking we need to introduce, new ways of doing things that, you know, some of it's unintentional, but the bureaucracy isn't necessarily set up to do what we want to do. So then we got to figure out, how do you change the hearts and minds to accelerate, you know, the impact?
I think that's a very good question for the Q&A. So nobody go away. We'll dig into how you do that. We have just a couple minutes before we need to go to our breakout groups. And I'd like to end with this part of our program with a question about sharing. I've heard all of you say at some point that this is a model that can be replicated in other places. Could someone speak to that and what that really means? And I'm sure the people participating today would very much like to hear that.
Yeah, if I could I know we don't have much time, but I think the two of the really important ways that we can be an example in the county, but also just the watershed, the 4 Mile Creek watershed. We're in a 76,000 acre watershed here. Two important elements are in this example we can create for other watersheds in Iowa and other places is let's use science. Let's look at the data. Let's look at what the water samples are telling us in our creeks and rivers and what's coming out of our tiles. I think that's important, but also let's look at the long term. Let's take the long-term view in agriculture. How do we, instead of just thinking short term, one season after another of our crop rotation, let's take the long-term view and looking at soil health and water quality. And let's be an example in both of those areas. That's what I see.
Okay, it's 1:40. That's my cue. We are going to move to breakout groups now. Thank you all. I know Katie has to take off at 2. She'll be in some of the breakout groups here. But thank you so much again for this conversation.
I'll introduce myself. I'm Sherry Fisher with the Missouri Department of Conservation. I sit on the steering committee for Fishers and Farmers.
I'm Muriel Strand. I'm an absentee owner of land in Webster County, and I live 5 miles south of the California capital. And I have no idea actually what these filters are or what they're supposed to do or the technology or anything. So I have, anyway.
Right. Well, we can discuss that. Yeah.
I'm Craig Fisnick. I'm with Sam County Foundation in Wisconsin. We help some farmers install prairie strips in Wisconsin. So we, much like you've done, and we're really intrigued by this sort of bulk buy idea of doing practices like prairie strips in bulk in a more efficient contracting way.
Great.
I'm Kim Meyer. I'm in Madison, Wisconsin area. I work with Yahara Winds and Madison Metro Sewage District. I work with farmer groups. So.
Great. Lee Tesdell Century Farm, Slater, Iowa, and enjoyed my 2 years in Madtown. Not centuries, but decades ago. And be glad to explain saturated buffers if anybody wants to hear about them.
I was just Googling them while you guys were talking.
There are some really nice diagrams online that you can find that show very well. Yeah.
So is it to buffer water movement?
Kind of, sort of. So what we do is we intercept a tile that's draining a field, and we intercept it, and we put in a second tile that parallels a creek or a stream, and then that it's on a slope, and so that water that's released from the perforated tile flows by gravity down towards the stream. And so what happens is the vegetation in that area, the biological activity underground denitrifies that water to a certain extent. Of course, not 100%, but to a certain extent. So basically, it's kind of a biological filter of roots and plant life underground that eats up that excess nitrate that's in the tile water before it gets into the stream. Does that make sense?
Is that a prairie strip? Is it different than the prairie strips?
It could be on a prairie strip. That land next to the stream could be planted in prairie, and that could be prairie strips. Mine are not. They're brome grass. My prairie strips are in a different area, but it could be, yes. But you need that vegetative growth where that water filters down towards the creek to be effective.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Hey, you guys, if you want, I'll throw out something that came to mind to me about something we would need to do differently to make this work. I think that traditionally we, and it sounds like you did previously as well, try to push as many practices as possible onto a landowner contact, getting that one little postage stamp of land into a better condition. And your theory of taking one practice at a time in a distinct area seems like not only something we would need to do differently, but something that worked really well for you and would help to build faith and trust in that one practice.
Yeah.
I would offer, as far as ways to think differently with conservation practices, we think there has to be a contract and there has to be proof the money was spent properly, and we can't have failure in the contracting. And if you open up innovative ideas, you also open up the opportunity for failure. So right. I don't know, in the saturated buffer case, I don't know how many farmers maybe got into it or got signed up and then didn't do it, or if any money was spent on construction easements, but then they didn't happen. But if we're air traffic controllers, we can't afford to ever fail, right? Because one failure is tragedy. And if you're talking about like bulk use of cover crops or other type of incentives for practices, if you can bundle it together and do it in some efficient system, even if only 8 or 9 out of 10 attempts work, it's okay to fail once in a while if you are providing a method that more people will buy into and overcoming that hassle factor they talked about with typical individual contracting.
Yeah, that's a good point, Craig. I actually have a neighbor who put in a saturated buffer that didn't work. So, and I still don't understand the reasons, but it had to do with intercepting old tiles as they put in the new tile down towards the creek, and somehow water was going somewhere else or something. An example from my farm, we're 9 years into using cover crops. This spring was so dry that Mike couldn't plant the day he wanted to plant because apparently the cereal rye roots, the cereal rye had become so robust and it was so dry and hard that he couldn't plant And so you had to come back after a rain to be able to plant. So you're right. Innovation opens up the chance for failure as well. Right. Yeah. I would say, Sherry, that one of the things we need to look at is that we have to give up maybe is work away from the short-term view in agriculture, kind of seasonal, what's my yield going to be, short-term view, and look more towards a long-term view of soil health and water quality. And I know that's hard on rented ground because the tenant is just paying cash year by year and trying to get the biggest yield possible, while maintaining profitability. And but it's a hard thing to get away from, right? To move from that short-term view to the long-term view. And
so it has to go beyond the renter to the actual landowner, because they're the ones that can see the short-term view. Right.
They need, and the landowner needs to, they both need to change their thinking a little bit, in my opinion. Yeah. Right.
So in terms of thinking differently, I am not well acquainted with my land, but it is somewhat tiled, and I've been advised to add tiling to it. But what the tiling tells me is that I'm making the land do something it doesn't want to do. And so I don't exactly see my way clear, but I'm like, well, what does the land want to do? And how can that be beneficial in whatever way?
Right.
And I think taking out old tile sounds impractical, but I think it kind of sediments up over time and probably just stops working.
Yeah.
So apparently my land is a prairie pothole land.
Right. Yeah. You and I are both in what's called the Des Moines lobe. And there were a lot of wetlands when the European settlers first came here. And so we created this leaky system, I call it. We switched from perennial plants on the landscape to annual, and then we drained the wet areas. And so we created this leaky system.
John, you were on a roll there. Too bad you got cut off. just gearing up for the grand finale, and bloop, off it went.
There's never a good time to cut off good conversations. So
you can call me later for the punchline.
Yeah.
You can share it in the Q&A.
I think everybody's back, man. So
back. Okay. You took a little time to reflect on what would we need to let go of to adopt something like this. Amy's going to call on your group leaders one by one just to share a few reflections.
Yeah, and group leaders, turn your video on, unmute yourself. First up is Kim Meyer.
Hi, so I guess I didn't take really good notes. I spent a lot of time listening. But yeah, some of the thinking was just changing how we think about conservation. There was just comments made about looking bigger picture. I apologize. I didn't realize I was supposed to take notes.
That's okay. You don't have to do a formal report back.
Okay.
Was there a big idea that really landed for you?
I was thinking a little bit about some of my own thinking when you talk about conservation, and like, at least for me, I always focus in on the one farmer and look at their one problems, but really this group did more of a watershed or a neighborhood assessment. And that's really not the way that conservation typically works, but obviously there's some huge success in that. So I think all of our organizations can learn from that and take a bigger picture, look at things to solve, obviously, what is a pretty big problem. So
thank you.
Okay, that works. Next group, David Zentner. Hope I'm saying it right.
Thank you. It is Zentner. and happy to be with everyone. I'm from Minnesota, and we struggled a little bit in a really brief time, at least I did. And so the other participants can help me with what we need to let go of in terms of our thinking. It appeared to me, and I'll say very quickly, that the approach by the SWCD was so solid with both the farm producers and the landowners that there was a sort of a preordained willingness to listen and to say, okay, if the outlet monitoring shows this, I'll make those adjustments. And so it wasn't so much as that as I thought, as presenting something that didn't require a new customized equipment, expense, a lot of change and frustration over change. I'm really impressed. It sounds like a wonderful project. For an outsider to be here today has been a privilege.
Good, thank you, David. The next leader was Jean McGuire, but it looks like either she left or she got kicked off to someone who was in Jean's group. That would be John, Jeff, or Jack. One of you guys want to give a little synopsis of what you guys talked about? Don't everybody speak at once.
I can, if I can remember to. I mean, we didn't have a whole lot of time to talk about too much, but you know, the idea of getting away from business as usual was really what we focused on, whether that be in the way grants are set up and the rigidity of them, or certain practices done a certain way. This program seems like it, you know, it isn't beholden to those traditional rules. And then also just kind of getting away from the traditional shotgun approach, right? The easy work where somebody comes in, you deal with those concerns, and you know, wait till somebody else comes in. And then the concept of actually targeting and, you know, generating the biggest bang for the buck or whatever, it's like, oh well, we can't do that, we've never done that before, you know, it's not possible. You know, why would you talk to somebody and tell them they have a problem, kind of thing. So and Jack, I don't know, feel free to add.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, we kind of co-led the whole thing. So Katie was in our group. She left, but she said she was surprised at all the different pots of money. But you know, this idea that you can't get into any one pot, but the creativity of being able to dip into the different funding to help support, and then having people on the team, whether it's farmers, agents, or otherwise, step up, be a leader, say, I'm going to take action, and then trust each other that it'll get done. And then along with that, doing it, we've always done it this way, so we have to continue to do it that way. You just throw that aside. It's your water. Go out and meet with the landowners, get to the site. This is your water we're dealing with, that we're talking about, and then being proactive, open up all the options.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, there seems to be a real theme of persistence here, where the idea rises and gels a bit and becomes further articulated, and then it just needs to be looked at again and again until it comes together. I hope those conversations were useful. Is Heidi still here? No, she had to take off. Okay, we'll just move on to our Q&A, and our typical approach is just to have you be sure you're in gallery view. People are polite. We can take turns. Just ask your questions to the person you want to ask, or just ask one openly. We'll have a conversation. Amy, were there any?
I don't have any questions from the chat, so
okay.
Anyone who wants to go can feel free.
I have a question. I was wondering if the details of like specific agreements, draft agreements, or something that, you know, Tanner or somebody else might be willing to share, you know, so I'm not reinventing the wheel. And how complicated was that, and how long did it take to get the necessary paperwork in place before you could start implementing?
Yeah, so I think for sure we can kind of share some of those that framework for a lot of those documents that we drafted. I would say that we kind of developed them as we realized we needed them. So as far as how long it took, about 1.5 years total, probably. But if now that we kind of know what we know, if we were to sit down again, I think realistically, it's probably a few month process of getting all those agreements kind of put together and getting all the right parties at the table and getting everything signed and approved by all the boards that need to approve it. But for sure, I think if we want to make this replicable for other people, we need to share how we did it. I think making some of those agreements, obviously we might have to redact some information that's some PII issues and different things, but we can work on that.
We'll just send out all of Lee's.
There you go.
What did you say, Keegan?
I said, we'll just send all of Lee's out to everybody.
Yeah, just black out my let's see, my phone number and my social security number. I do actually have a question if that's all right. I was wondering how many of you are in watersheds or areas where you actually have good, reliable, regular water quality data. Do you have, water sampling going on in streams and rivers and maybe individual tiles, and what are you seeing? And how does that happen? In other words, who do you actually get to pull the samples and run the analyses?
I can just say many of the clients that we're working for, we work for a lot of public water supplies, and that's typically led by the city, and then universities, local colleges pitch in. And if there's somebody to actually organize that, and there's a willingness for sound data management, because the worst thing you can do with monitoring is do it and then not do anything with the data, right? And so many people don't think about the management of the information after the fact, and then it all goes to waste, right? But where you have a well-oiled machine, it usually seems to be a combination of, a funder like a city that's using it to maybe predict things like when algal blooms might hit in their reservoir and adjusting treatment type stuff. And then, you've got kind of the grunt work done by, interns and the university, but somebody still has to manage, oversee, and deal with the data. Right.
Yeah, it makes us feel good. We're putting in, 51 saturated buffers, and we're doing all this cover. A few of us are doing cover crops and all that. But what does the data show us? Are we really dropping the end content amount in 4 Mile Creek? That's the end of the day. We want to see that reduction, right?
And it's not cheap to do that, because you have, you really need real-time sensors. Good ones are not inexpensive. You have to, have infrastructure at bridge crossings or whatever. Monitoring sediment is a big pain in the butt and takes a lot of work, because most of the load comes at like 2 events during a year, right? And you've got to get it at the peak or the rising edge of that. Otherwise, you're not getting most of the sediment. And, same with nitrogen too. And then you can't mess up the flow. People, stream flow, if you have something that isn't gauged, and you want to calculate loading and what benefits you've had in the watershed, if you're not calculating flow or measuring it properly, though, you're not going to see anything. It just takes resources and commitment to do it right.
Right. I want to amplify what Lee's saying, and Jeff, your response. In Polk County, we're working on our 5-year strategic plan, and we've identified 4 different priority areas, and the infrastructure program we're talking about today is one of those signature projects, with the idea of teaching ourselves how do we do things that can scale to the rest of the state. So infrastructure is one part, soil health is another part, priority areas.
I'm actually on a video call, but it's okay.
Same idea that we can have impact by working together. And then the third area, which relates to this part of the discussion, is monitoring and mapping. And mapping is super critical for the targeting, and the monitoring is really important to help us understand where we can drive, or where we need to drive the investments in the infrastructure and the soil health and the land use management. And the questions, what I see often happening is we focus too much first on the data and not enough on first, what are the key questions we want to answer, and then use the data collection to answer those questions. And your point, Jeff, the real-time sensors. And so Polk County, one of the things I'm super excited about is creating a monitoring system. We're missing a few pieces where we can actually see what's coming into the county and what's going out of the county. And what are we adding to the piece of the pie? And that's really informative and important for not just what I call status questions. Can we fish, swim, drink the water? But as important, what are we going to do about it? What are the management implications? And that's where we get into things. We switch from thinking about concentrations of stuff in the water to loading. What's coming down the river, and when is it coming down, and how do we address that? So I love that commentary between Lee and Jeff.
Yeah,
And I
and
like the mapping part of it too. And Iowa's been great in this. The state I live in, it sucks when it comes to mapping the conservation work that's already been done. I mean, the struggle I have just understanding and getting to know from people where conservation has gone in, it's literally impossible. The USDA just says, well, we don't even track that. I can't even tell you, we don't even know. I mean, nuts, right? And then, you know, so then you've got to go to LiDAR, you've got to go to aerial imagery, you got to drive the watershed, which is great. But then what about the invisible practices? Where's the nutrient management that you can't see for the road? Where are all these other things? So mapping and tracking the actual work is super important, because then you can kind of put the stuff aside that you've already done and start focusing to fill in the holes.
Tanner or Keegan, talk about the mapping tool that you guys use to help identify the priority sites. The 50 we're doing now, but I don't think we've mentioned we're going to do what, 100 second phase? Is that right?
That's the number we keep throwing out. Yeah, hopefully we can get there.
Maybe 150.
Talk about the mapping tool. How are you doing the targeting?
So initially, kind of when we were trying to find sites, we used the ACPF tool, which is the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework tool. And that basically identified potential saturated buffer sites based on soil types, grades, bank heights, different things like that. Obviously, the real tricky thing when trying to find saturated buffer sites is we could have a perfect bank, but we don't know if there's tile outlets there. We don't know if it's tile drained. In our area, most things are tile drained. So luckily, a lot of hits we had, we were able to find outlets. But that was kind of our initial way we mapped and did the kind of targeted outreach. We found that after a year of doing it, that maybe that tool could use some improvement. It's very strict in what sites it recommends. It kind of knocks off a lot of sites that we were actually able to install saturated buffers on. It's just very strict. And like I said, those soil types and slopes and different things. So that was kind of our initial outreach. Obviously, keeping track of where these are all located is a big deal. And we do have them all on maps, and I have them all on maps. Obviously, like you mentioned with the USDA not being able to share information, being that a lot of this work was done out of an NRCS office and a lot of the documentation or kind of the landowner information was acquired from USDA databases, we do run into that kind of PII, personally identifiable information rules with the NRCS, where we can't post people's addresses or which farms and tracts did this or that. And I think moving forward with the project, we're looking at maybe getting some sort of waiver that we can sign beforehand if farmers are willing to share that information. Because I feel like a lot of the people we worked with on this project wouldn't have an issue with us saying that we did this project in their fields. It's just that we need to get that kind of written permission so we're clear and good to go on the NRCS side of things. But
yeah, rules allow for that to be shared if the landowner says it's okay. They just have to say it's okay. I mean, for new projects, you just put that into the agreement, you know, must share location, no other information, but practice and location. I mean, I rarely meet any producer that doesn't want that. I mean, so rare that they say no. As long as I'm not giving out their social security number and everything, it's fine.
Yeah. Jeff, are you in Wisconsin?
As Jeff has said,
I'm in Illinois.
Illinois.
Yeah.
Just Dave Zentner, real quickly, as Jeff said, we have a part of our Upper Mississippi River Initiative project with the Isaac Long League, the Austin, Minnesota chapter on the Red River and the Cedar River, excuse me, a big source to work on in Iowa, developed a program focused on E. coli and identifying the DNA identification of the source. And it's a fairly long story, but it's described as water quality monitoring with a purpose, meaning it isn't just monitoring in store it and to archive it, it's to get at the problem. So we found that the E. coli exceedances on parts of the Cedar River system in southern Iowa exceeded recreational body contact. And that the crib flowed through the nature center in this city of Austin, Minnesota. And the chief architect of our project, a man by the name of Larry Dolphin, is a retired executive director of the Hormel Family Nature Center or Nature Center. And what they did is went right away to the county health department, the county board, and found a fairly defensive relationship, turned that into a good working relationship with set targets, focused on 1,700 septic systems, and some direct flow into some of those cribs, with the estimation that 50% of the 1,700 were violating the standards and contributing to the E. coli problem. And working together to take what the health department originally said, we don't have the funding, we don't have the staff, this is a 22-year time to get this done. Thank you very much, you guys. And turn that into a 5 to 10-year target, working together to seek funding. And we're in the process now of bringing that into Iowa with 4 chapters on the Cedar River downstream of Austin to work together. And we're finding some fatigue with volunteer monitors that have done monitoring work and then felt exhausted and it didn't go anywhere. So, but to Jeff's point, and then I'll stop, we've had, as a result of the work there that the Austin group has done, Jeff's right, we've had landowners say, would you monitor our land or the creek that goes through our watershed? I'd like to know what's going on there. Initially, not terribly excited about us doing that, but now feeling very comfortable with it. So that's just one example.
Yeah, thank you.
There have been a couple of people who put questions in the chat. The first one is, how did you choose your first focus best management practice?
Yeah, so I can kind of comment on that. So I guess the very beginning of this process, when we decided that we wanted to kind of expand and focus on one thing, saturated buffers, one kind of jumped out to us because we did have the funding in place locally to be able to fund a lot of these projects all at once. We weren't going to run into funding issues. And then, like we kind of mentioned there, or at least we did in, I guess, our breakout session, they're not super invasive to the landowner. In a lot of cases, they already have existing buffers that they don't have to take extra cropland out of production or different. There's not a large ask from the landowner up front, so they're relatively marketable. And then as far as then choosing between the edge of field practices options we had between like saturated buffers and bioreactors, we kind of made the decision to go with saturated buffers as a first choice and bioreactors as a secondary choice, because saturated buffers at the end of the day cost typically about 1/3 of what a bioreactor does, and they have a longer lifespan. Bioreactors, obviously, that pit of wood chips is a finite carbon source. Eventually, that source is going to be used up, and we're going to have to go in and clean out those wood chips and put fresh wood chips in to kind of refresh that carbon source. With a saturated buffer, the plants in that carbon-rich topsoil naturally reproduce that carbon and kind of keep refreshing that filter naturally. And they have a much longer lifespan, as well as being more cost efficient as comparative to bioreactors. So we kind of took the idea that if a saturated buffer could work there, we wanted to do a saturated buffer. If we couldn't make a saturated buffer work because we had too much slope coming into it, or we had too much water flowing through that tile, or we just simply didn't have enough area to run our lateral lines, it wasn't level enough, then we would kind of look at a bioreactor as a secondary option.
There's one more question here for you guys too. How did the feasibility of sites affect the amount of eligible sites you were able to get enrolled?
Yeah, Keegan might be a good one to talk on this. He mentioned kind of how we narrowed down some of our sites.
Yeah, the biggest thing we wanted to make sure was there's enough, acreage coming in on that outlet to kind of warrant a treatment, I guess. So, once we kind of sat back down and looked at our surveys, and then we went and looked at the contour maps and could figure out like, well, this tile line is probably only pulling in 5 or 10 acres. So we definitely threw more than a handful of sites like that out at one point in time. So like Tanner mentioned, they surveyed about 130 sites, so we maybe could have done that on the front end looking back at it. And maybe that's something we do differently here for this round 2. They also took some water samples. So Tannerson and Polk SWC has done a nice job of getting a lot of monitoring into this watershed. And so they took advantage of that. And, we wanted to make sure there's actually nitrogen coming out of that pipe before we, invested in a treatment practice. So there had to be a resource concern there. And kind of going back on how Tanner mentioned saturated buffers 1, bioreactors 2, with bioreactors, it's definitely important consideration to know that that tile line has a lot of water coming through it and also has nitrogen to warrant that investment into bioreactors. But we're pretty self-conscious, I guess, about making sure we're selecting the right sites, since we know, like, once we started figuring out that this project was going to take off and people would be interested in it, we definitely wanted to make sure we weren't just putting a site out there just to get another number.
Yep, that's a good point.
One more point on the comparison is that on my farm anyway, the saturated buffer is much more efficient at taking out nitrate than the wood chip bioreactor is. So the numbers on my farm are 2 years of data, 90% denitrification on the saturated buffer and 58% on the wood chip bioreactor, and that's 7 years of data. So that's another advantage probably. I'm not sure that they all show that difference, but mine certainly does.
And saturated buffers weren't around, Lee, when you did that first bioreactor install. Otherwise, we might have done a saturated buffer on that site instead of a bioreactor, perhaps.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is worth noting too that there are some other advantages to bioreactors. With a saturated buffer, like I said, we need that kind of flat area along the stream, and we need an actual stream running through the farm field. A bioreactor you can do in the middle of a farm field. There doesn't have to be a stream to outlet like a saturated buffer does. They're a little more versatile in the areas we can put them in, but we do try to prioritize saturated buffers as kind of the #1 option for a multitude of reasons we've mentioned.
Under this fiscal agent model, were you guys able to utilize USDA cost share dollars for that fiscal agent, or does it have to be, can you even do that?
Well, we didn't this time, but we could have. You could utilize, EQIP has an assignment of payment form that the landowner, we would have had them fill out had we gone through EQIP. We didn't do EQIP initially because we didn't want to mess around with batching dates. Looking back at that, we would have had enough time to be patient and wait for these batching dates to come up. So we could have used EQIP. So going forward, I think we'll be looking to utilize EQIP on it.
Yeah, so that could be a good RCPP project too, given there's more flexibility on that. As long as the landowner's not having to deal with all of it. That's the thing.
People like Tanner have to deal with all of it.
Yeah, that's right.
So regarding CRP, you didn't use any CRP because you can't assign payment, am I correct? And then is looking forward, I mean, at some point, there's only so much money from Iowa Department of Agriculture in Des Moines Does that need to get worked out if we want to scale this up statewide and have a lot more farmers utilize these practices?
Oh, yeah, for sure. We kind of went through the process planning on utilizing clear funds through FSA and through the kind of CRP traditional processes. And we kind of found out, I think Keegan mentioned earlier, towards the end, they kind of dropped the ball on us that the way they calculate their percent of cost share they provide is they will pay up to 50% of landowner cost. And with our fiscal agent model, we were assigning all the payments over to the county. So on paper, there is no landowner cost. So FSA would pay 50% of $0. And that was kind of how they ruled that how their program was structured. We're obviously looking to change that in the future, because in my opinion, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And obviously it would help us get a lot more projects in the ground if we could kind of stretch our state funding farther and get more of those federal dollars involved.
Those are some of those conversations that definitely like ADMC as an organization we're trying to have with USDA, because like, you know, a big buzzword all the time is partnerships, but a lot of the USDA programming right now kind of excludes partnerships from actually being able to come and leverage all that funding. So we're hoping that we can make some progress on that. And, you know, it didn't just affect our program. We actually were modeling it around the Iowa DNR has the Iowa Habitat Accessibility Program, IHAP, where basically they were doing almost a fiscal agent model where the DNR would, you know, come in and they'd enroll some CRP practice with a private landowner, but the DNR would provide the 50% cost share to allow, you know, the public then would be able to come access that land in the future. And they were pretty successful in that, but all of a sudden with this new interpretation of the Farm Bill rules, that kind of put the halts on their IHAP program as well. So there's more people than just us, I guess, interested in changing that with FSA.
Some of that, I think some of that, again, I go back and think about the video we watched at the top of the show. And one of the points was something about new perspectives. And as Tanner and Keegan are describing, interpretation has something to do with perspective. If you understand the vision of what we're trying to do, you may be able to interpret those rules in a new way with that perspective. And so if you're behind the desk and looking at the form and say, well, gosh, this has never been done this way. Well, you know, maybe with people understanding what the vision is and the right people up the food chain saying, hey, yeah, we can interpret the rules this way. This is a new perspective that will help us, you know, ramp up and accelerate the scalability and the ability to drive down the cost, the unit economics of the installations that we're talking about. So I think, you know, that's exciting. And one other, I think the federal part is absolutely critical. You know, the federal government needs to be part of the solution. And so how do we align the federal policies, particularly through the Farm Bill? Farmers are very rational decision makers, I think, when it comes to the economic signals they receive. And a lot of the problems we have today on the ground are the direct or indirect result of our Farm Bill policies. So if we want to see different results, we got to change the economic signals that we're sending to the farmers. And this is just one example.
Maybe a related question is, even if you could sort out those issues, if the farmer still has to go sign a contract, CRP or EQIP, even if they can assign payment, that's a hassle factor. Whereas if it's all fiscal agent and they don't have to do any money exchange, it's just agreeing to have the practice installed turnkey, like you've said, right? On some, I mean, compare those two. Like, do you see this still necessitating an individual contract? I mean, obviously you have to have some agreement with the farmer to allow you to do all this. But where does it need a monetary exchange on something like a buffer if you're not taking land out of production? Or can it exist with all the hassle of contracting removed if it's just an agreement that I, the farmer, am getting this done on my behalf, it's turnkey, they're handling all that, I don't have to find a contractor, but I don't need to contract my own separate cost share agreement to do that.
Tanner, there's a question for you in the chat. Were the Were the landowner easement payments standardized based on acreage? Does it lock the agreement practice into a term? What was the average payment?
Yeah, so they were standardized, but not based on acreage. We did them, we determined we had funding for $1,000 per tile outlet treated. So that was kind of our way of standardizing the amount given. And then as far as locking the agreement into a term, we did kind of our standardized maintenance agreements with these that we do for most practices through the Soil and Water Conservation District, where the landowner signed a 10-year maintenance agreement, agreeing with saturated buffers, basically that they won't tear them out of the ground in the next few years. But we tried to avoid a lot of that with obviously not targeting areas that are primed for development in the next few years, focusing areas that we think will be farmed for the foreseeable future. But having that maintenance agreement also in a rare instance where a tile line gets damaged or the control structure gets damaged, we have something in place that basically ensures our practice will be treating water for at least the foreseeable future.
And it was nice, just kind of the order of events on these things. The maintenance agreement was signed before it was constructed, which in typical practices, it's the other way around. But so that's kind of when people were locked into doing this, because we couldn't, obviously, once we put this out to bid in a fiscal agent format to a contractor, we couldn't have landowners pull out on us. And so we had them sign this maintenance agreement prior to actually having the installs happen.
Yep. I wanted to respond to Craig's question too. I think that, one of the things we did with the turnkey approach was that there was still a contract with each landowner, but it was very simplified in terms of what they had to do. And if money has to change hands, that would be possible, I think, as well. What I get real excited about is this is just the first step. The saturated buffers still pretty much have a one-to-one relationship with the farmer, right? The farmer is putting in a piece of, or having put in a piece of, or landowner putting in a piece of infrastructure on the edge of the field that really just treats the water on their field. The next big opportunity is to look at the drainage district level. We have 3,700 of those in Iowa. Those are those are the systems that move water across farm fields between properties, multiple properties. And so one of the things we got to figure out how to do is to cite some of the long-term infrastructure, which we don't always think of it this way, but wetlands are an important piece of long-term infrastructure. Here in Iowa, we have several flavors. One's called a crepe wetland, a breakpoint, typically 60 to 70 acres, and it drains 1 to 2% of that footprint it represents 1 to 2% of a larger wetland or watershed, excuse me. So it's hundreds to thousands of acres. And what the wetland does that the saturated buffer doesn't do is it provides a whole lot of additional benefits beyond just the water filtration, which is super important, but it has wildlife and pollinator habitat and so forth. And in our fiscal analysis, our so-called nutrient reduction strategy, none of those benefits were considered. And none of the benefits, the long-term benefits, the saturated buffer is maybe a 20 to 40 year project. Keegan and Tanner, is that about right? 20 to 40 year, what useful life? A wetland, if not a perpetual asset, is the weir itself is the 100 to 150 years. We need to be thinking really long-term with some of this infrastructure than the stuff that can scale. In Iowa, we have 1,600 crepe wetland sites we've identified, and we're still crawling. We really got to figure out how to accelerate and have those conversations with the landowners, not one at a time, collectively within these drainage districts. And how can we site the storage and the filtration assets that need to be added to the systems? And I think we can do it. I think if we pull people together and we break down some of the barriers that we've created for ourselves, everybody for themselves, hey, let's go back to our history. That's why we have ag cooperatives. That's how we settled. Europeans settled. The Indian tribes ran around as tribes. People want to do things collectively. And I think we can do that. That would be the next step. Hopefully not too far down the road, but these guys are creating some of the learning of how do we do things in systems. So I'm super excited to see this go forward, but there's more to come.
One final question. Does anyone have anything pressing they still want to ask? One more chance. I have one question. If someone really wants to talk to you in depth about this, who should they contact?
That's a good question. I would say if they want to get in touch about specifically this project, either myself or John Swanson or Keegan are all great contacts. John Swanson's pretty busy, so I feel I don't really want to dump that on his shoulders. So I'll be welcome to talk to anyone who has any questions about specifically this project. If they're looking at doing this kind of in your own area, I would say start by reaching out to your local NRCS office. And hopefully, even if they don't have a program set up like this, just you talking to them about it might spur them to be interested in setting up a program like this.
If they want a farm tour, come on over.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Tanner. So thank you all for being here. What a great conversation. So thank you. Keep coming back. Reach out to people, ask your questions. We're stronger together. So thanks.
Thanks.
Everybody.
Thanks,
Take care,
everybody.
everyone. 1 hour, thanks.